Self-mummification. Imagine joining a very strict diet regimen that you become a mummy at the end. But that's the goal of self-mummification, which sounds like a wild way to commit but is an extreme display of devotion for certain Buddhist monks in Japan. These monks believe that by mummifying themselves alive, they could attain a higher spiritual state and ultimately achieve enlightenment. The process starts by reducing your food intake dramatically. You transition from a regular diet to one of nuts and seeds. This was to help shed body fat, making mummification easier. You would also consume a toxic plant called urushi, which prevents your body from decaying, sort of like giving yourself an internal, permanent do not disturb sign for the afterlife. As soon as you're ready to become a mummy, you'd retreat to a specially prepared tomb, often just a small cave or a pit, where you meditate while ringing a bell. The idea was to keep this up until you kick the bucket, or at least until your stomach growls louder than your thoughts. If you did the process correctly, your body would dehydrate, eventually mummify, and leave behind a preserved figure that future generations could admire or be a little creeped out by. However, Emperor Meiji made self-mummification illegal, even if it was a religious practice. The ban was largely due to health and ethical concerns. Of course, there were far better ways of proving your faith without slowly turning yourself into a corpse. Karma burial. You know, karma works by balancing your good and bad deeds when you die, so that your reincarnation depends on whichever between your good and bad karma is higher. But some people couldn't wait until real death to try to erase their bad karma. That's why they participated in karma burial. The idea of karma burial was that allowing yourself to get buried alive could settle your karmic debts in one go, like paying off all your spiritual credit cards at once by fast-tracking your death. It was believed that the act of voluntarily embracing death in such a way could purify your soul, fast-tracking you to a better reincarnation or even enlightenment. It worked by allowing you to dig your grave, perform rituals, and then get buried alive. The belief was that enduring this fate with peace and acceptance would make you earn major karmic points, allowing you to have a good reincarnation in the next cycle. So if you murdered someone today, you'd probably think it's best to bury yourself alive and die to cancel out that bad karma and convince the divine to give you a good life when you respawn. So as strange as it may sound, it was a ritual that gives a whole new meaning to rest in peace, because the resting part happens while you're still alive. But that's the problematic part of this practice. Getting buried alive isn't exactly a fast track to spiritual cleansing, but more like an express ticket to the afterlife. The practice didn't sit well with authorities who didn't want to encourage people to prematurely unalive themselves. Unsurprisingly, the practice got banned because it was one of those rituals that needed a line to be drawn between religious devotion and extreme practices. Temple prostitution. Imagine going to a temple to pray and connect with the Creator, but someone tells you that you must strip down to your birthday suit and offer yourself to the divine by offering yourself to everyone. That's what temple prostitution was about. The basic idea was that devotees, often women, would engage in sexual acts with a temple or sacred space as part of religious rituals. If you participated in such acts, you'd be considered to be offering your bodies as a form of devotion to a deity, often linked to fertility, love, or war gods or goddesses. While the basic idea was to please the gods, you'd also be pleasing everyone in the neighborhood. One day, you're just saying good morning to your neighbor Bob. The next day, he'd be visiting you in the temple so that you'd please the gods by giving him the time of his life. However, a lot of people didn't necessarily like the idea of getting pimped out by their religious leaders. Temple prostitution wasn't even necessary in a lot of religions that practiced it. In many cases, it was more like divine peer pressure, as everyone around you would be forcing you to do it, even when you had no interest in getting steamy with some locals you encounter regularly. Over time, the practice of temple prostitution became controversial, especially with the rise of monotheistic religions like Christianity and Islam. Castrati. Churches in Italy took choir singing so seriously that they were willing to go balls out on producing the best male choir singers. This is where the creation of castrati comes in as one of the most extreme religious practices that are now banned. The castrati were male singers castrated before puberty to maintain their high-pitched voices. So if you were born with the best singing voice in the business, you'd have to say goodbye to passing your genetics to the next generation of choir singers because you won't have the balls for that. This practice became prominent in Italy from the 16th to 19th centuries. Castrati were famous for their powerful yet angelic voices, blending the range of a soprano or alto with an adult male's lung capacity and vocal power. But while the castrati could sing hymns that could open the pearly gates, the Catholic Church eventually banned this practice. While initially accepting the practice due to the beauty of the castrati singing, the Church began to see it as exploitative and inhumane, especially because because the targets were vulnerable kids who couldn't properly consent to this practice. The church's view on castration also evolved, seeing it as a way of interfering with the natural order of human development. After all, you can't go forth and multiply if your lack of testicles doesn't want to cooperate with the multiplication part. The church also sees the body as a sacred thing that shouldn't be altered drastically, particularly in a religious context. Ultimately, while an angelic voice can help you win the next Catholic Glee Club competition, it's not worth losing your manhood. Self-immolation. When you look at the streets, you'd see that protesters would rather bring out signs and megaphones to air their concerns or call people out. In modern times, younger people would rather do it on social media, canceling and calling out certain government or religious personalities. But during the 20th century, some religious groups turned themselves into real-life versions of the Human Torch by setting themselves on fire. In religious history, some cases of self-immolation were seen as the ultimate demonstration of faith or resistance to oppression. Monks used to protest against government persecution, believing that setting themselves on fire was the best way to call out injustices. The logic was that they thought self-sacrifice and turning into a bonfire would catch government officials' attention better than simply putting up signs on the street. After all, if you're a government official, you wouldn't want your streets to be full of burning monks. On the part of these religious groups, they believed that self-immolation wasn't going to harm them because their god was on their side. So if they came out relatively safe and not fully burnt like a medium rare steak, they thought their god favored their cause, and that the governments should listen to the word of the divine. Exorcism by beating. Exorcism is basically a battle between good and evil, as the exorcist uses the power of God to force a demon out of a possessed person. But exorcism by beating takes that one step further by turning the exorcism into a one-sided Street Fighter game where you beat the crap out of the possessed person. The idea is that you beat the person so hard that the demon would be like, "Nope, I'm out of here," after enough punches. Historically speaking, exorcism rituals date back thousands of years and have been present in different cultures and religions. However, exorcism by beating stands out because it's not the most compassionate approach. In fact, in many cases, it crossed the line into outright abuse. In medieval Europe and other parts of the world, some people believed that mental illness, epilepsy, or other unexplained behavior was a result of demonic possession, and beating the person was considered a cure. You can probably imagine how that went. Instead of a peaceful ritual, you'd get a situation where the poor person being treated would be in a beatdown where they can't fight back. Sometimes people died from it, which is why it was eventually banned in many places. Carolingian trial by ordeal. Let's say you're living in the Carolingian Empire and were accused of a crime. Instead of a courtroom drama with all the lawyers and jury members, your crime is judged differently. They let your faith decide whether or not you're innocent. This religious practice involved straightforward ordeals, where the church would look at how strong your faith is by letting you go through tough challenges as if you were in an episode of American Ninja Warrior, with more flames involved. They would make you walk on hot iron or plunge your hand into boiling water. If you emerge from the test alive and with your skin intact, you are a saint who didn't deserve punishment. But if you were thoroughly harmed, God didn't favor you because you're guilty. The logic behind the Carolingian trial by ordeal was that divine intervention was the ultimate judge. God was supposed to be the only one who could determine your innocence. He would use his power to protect you from harm if you were truly innocent, so it was really a test of your faith, because God would make you suffer if your faith wasn't strong enough to deserve his protection. It was like a game show where the prize for winning was your freedom. However, this practice didn't stick around forever because even the traditional Carolingian Empire's beliefs evolved. By the 12th century, trials by ordeal were officially banned and set aside in favor of more modern legal systems. After all, no one chose the risk of getting burned over a full-blown court case. Foot binding. Foot fetish was at a different level many years ago when Chinese religion and philosophy believed that women with small feet were the most beautiful. That's why young girls' feet were tightly bound to keep them small, preserving the beauty of women as they grow and age. It became a symbol of status and femininity, but also had serious downsides. The process involved wrapping the feet so tightly that the bones deformed and the toes were bent under, often causing intense pain, infection, and lifelong disabilities. Now imagine trying to walk on feet that are essentially squished into tiny packages. It wasn't just uncomfortable, but was also harmful. Women with their feet bound could hardly walk properly, which meant they often depended on others for mobility. The practice wasn't just a beauty standard, but severely impacted their quality of life. Fast forward to the modern era, and this practice has been widely condemned. The main reason for banning it is the obvious human rights and health concerns. Forcing someone to undergo such painful procedures for cosmetic reasons is seen as both cruel and unnecessary. Why bind your feet for beauty when you can go to a surgeon to make yourself look beautiful? So if foot binding hadn't been banned, China could have lost out on many of those Olympic medals if their women could hardly move. On the bright side, they could wear the same shoes they wore since childhood. Thuggy strangulation ritual. It's the 19th century, and India has a different kind of gang running around the country. Instead of these guys doing mischief, they are strangling people to death, all in the name of their goddess. This was a practice called the Thuggy. The thugs were people who believed in a goddess named Kali. They thought it was their divine duty to offer sacrifices to her through their preferred killing method, strangulation. Now, they preferred strangulation because it was their way of killing victims without shedding blood, which they believed was more pleasing to their goddess. They'd do this in a very systematic way, luring travelers, and then, well, taking their lives in a ritualized manner. So if a random Indian befriended you back then as you're traveling around the country, you're likely going to become their next victim. The British colonial authorities in India eventually realized what was happening. They saw it as both a serious crime and a threat to the safety of travelers. After all, you can't promote tourism in India if thugs were going around the country strangling tourists. Plus, the whole thing was totally against the laws and morals of the time, so the British cracked down hard on it. They launched campaigns to capture and prosecute the thugs, and banned the practice outright. Now, the thug word has become synonymous with good-for-nothing people who do crime like it's a regular day at work. Polygamy in the US. You probably know that in some religions, marriage isn't just between a man and a woman, but also between a man and a woman, a second woman, a third woman, and probably a fourth woman. That's because certain religions, such as Islam, minor Christian sects, Mormons, and Hinduism, promote polygamy, the practice of having multiple spouses. However, when there were too many Mormons practicing polygamy and messing up the entire marriage situation in the US, the government had to take a firm stance against it. And there were good reasons for that. One is that the government wanted to standardize marriage laws. In the 19th century, there was a big push to ensure that marriage was between one man and one woman. This was partly to align with societal norms and address legal issues arising from multiple marriages. Things like inheritance rights, child custody, and marital property could get really complicated with polygamous marriages. In a country that already has trouble dealing with thousands of lawsuits every day, dealing with legal problems related to polygamy would only make the courtroom situation worse. In 1862, Congress passed the Moral Anti-Bigamy Act, making it illegal to practice polygamy in U.S. territories. This law aimed to curb the practice among Mormons and reinforce the idea of monogamy. Later on, the Supreme Court upheld these laws, reinforcing the ban. So if you have dreams of starting a harem, you might want to take your dirty goals elsewhere. Dakma. The Zoroastrian religion had a cleanup crew that took care of dead bodies in the most natural but ritualistic way. This was called the Dakma, or the Tower of Silence, and it involved taking the bodies of dead members of this religion to a tower and allowing vultures to eat them. For those people, it's believed that the elements of earth, water, and fire are sacred. Placing bodies directly in them would contaminate these elements. As such, burial 6 feet under, throwing bodies into the water, and cremating the dead were out of the question. That's why they relied on vultures to clean up their mess. The vultures, of course, were willing participants in this ritual because it meant a free buffet for them. However, the practice has been banned in many countries for various reasons. One of the biggest issues is public health. Imagine if a tower filled with decaying bodies was sitting near your neighborhood. That's not exactly the kind of scenic view most people want. The smell and possible spread of disease are real concerns, especially as populations grow and urban sprawl pushes living communities closer to what were once remote areas. Governments have had to step in to ensure public safety, leading to bans on the practice in some areas. Another reason is the dwindling vulture population. Vultures are vital to the Dakma, but many species have faced severe declines, especially in places like India, due to chemicals found in livestock that harm vultures. Fewer vultures mean bodies take longer to decompose, which doesn't really help with public health concerns. Sometimes the practice has had to be halted simply because there aren't enough birds to keep up. So basically, the Dakma is a vulture buffet that got closed down because it couldn't pass the health inspection test. And these birds now have to go back to eating dead animals instead of prime human meat. Widow strangulation. You're a woman in Fiji, and your husband husband has just died from a disease. You think you can do what you want with your single life, such as traveling the world or rekindling an old romance. However, your local religious leader tells you that you need to die as well, so they strangle you to death in a practice called widow strangulation. This was an old ritual practiced in Fiji where widows were meant to die through strangulation to honor their deceased husbands. The idea was to ensure that both man and wife would find themselves again in the afterlife, where the wife could continue serving her duties of making sandwiches for her husband. Fortunately, the practice has been banned. The practice is ethically and morally problematic. It's based on the idea that widows are not free to do what they want. This is both a violation of their autonomy and a basic human right. This practice faced serious criticism from both within Fiji and internationally. The Fijian government, recognizing that it wasn't just a cultural relic but a harmful practice, decided to step in and break the strangulation up. In the early 19th century, when Fiji came under British colonial rule, the British authorities worked to end such practices. They enacted laws to protect human rights and improve social justice. Now, the only strangulation happening in a marriage is in bed, when spouses want to spice things up. Chapati. The vagina is a self-cleaning organ that does its job in overdrive during a woman's period. But the Hindus of Nepal don't exactly know that. They think that women are at their dirtiest whenever they're menstruating. That's why they practice Chapati, which is when they force menstruating women into small and unsafe huts away from their homes until the cycle ends. It might sound like a perfect excuse for men to get away from a woman's period mood swings, but Chapati is rooted in the idea that menstruating women are so impure they could bring bad luck and harm to their family, crops, or livestock if they stay inside the house. The problem isn't the isolation, but the conditions these women face when they're forced to stay away from home every month. It's like being banished to nature's least comfortable Airbnb. They're exposed to extreme cold, heat, and sometimes wild animals. Many lack access to proper food, clean water, or basic sanitation. As a result, Chapati can lead to serious health risks, like respiratory infections, pneumonia, and even death. Every year, several women die from this practice, often due to exposure, suffocation, or snake bites. Chapati also affects women's mental and emotional well-being. Being treated as unclean can cause feelings of shame and isolation. It keeps women trapped in a cycle of discrimination. In 2005, Nepal eventually banned the practice before criminalizing it in 2017. Despite Chapati's ban, however, some far-flung Nepalese communities still practice it. It's like that period cramp that never goes away. Cannibalism. Hannibal Lecter would have had the time of his life with the Korowai tribe, or an isolated Fijian community. That's because these traditional groups used to practice cannibalism as part of their religious rituals. There were a wide variety of reasons why they practiced cannibalism. Spiritually, they thought that doing so allowed them to gain the strength of the person consumed. Their religious rituals also required them to eat people as a form of showing their fear and respect to their gods. It was essentially their way of meeting their spiritual needs. But the practice eventually got banned when Europeans influenced this indigenous culture. You know that eating another human being is generally seen as a serious violation of basic human rights and dignity. So even if someone wanted to participate in a ritual involving cannibalism, society would see it as a pretty horrifying step back to a more brutal time in human history. It's hard to enjoy a nice meal when you know that you could be the one on the menu. Also, many countries have laws that specifically ban cannibalism, whether it's part of a religious practice or not. Those laws are often linked to other serious offenses like murder or desecration of a body. Try explaining in the courtroom why your neighbor's leg is being served on your dinner table, and you'll find yourself getting locked up for life quickly. Another huge reason is public health. Eating human flesh can lead to the spread of diseases. There's a condition called kuru, found among the Korowai tribe in Papua New Guinea, who practiced ritualistic cannibalism. It's a fatal brain disease caused by consuming human brains, kind of like zombies trying to get their daily dose of brain food, and that's not exactly something you want to go viral. So ultimately, you could say that's a law society is dead set on keeping cannibalism banned, even if some religions might not be too happy about not having human brains on the menu. Human ash burial mix. Imagine waking up to your morning coffee one day and your wife tells you your usual brewed coffee will be special today because it will come with a dash of your dead grandma's ashes. That's the practice of human ash burial mix, or HABM. It's common for many religions to cremate their deceased members, and they often keep the ashes in urns or throw them into the sea. But some Buddhist and Taoist groups in China take it one step further by mixing the ashes into food and drinks, kind of like a bizarre twist on a smoothie mix. And the reason is that it makes them them feel closer to their loved ones, because their remains are literally inside them. But eating or drinking something with human burial ash isn't exactly the best idea when there are safety, respect, and regulation issues involved. The mix could potentially cause health risks. While the concept might sound weird, blending human remains with other substances could pose hygiene and safety concerns. Ingesting someone's burial ashes also isn't the most respectful thing to do. Burial and cremation are traditional practices meant to honor and respect the deceased. Mixing ashes with food might be a tradition for some communities, but it's like serving your ashes in a cocktail. It's not exactly the most dignified way to go. Regulations also play a huge part. Different regions have strict laws about how human remains should be handled and disposed of because of public health and respect issues. So mixing ashes with food and drink might get you in trouble with the law, even if you think it's a good idea for grandma to continue living inside you. Cremation on open pyres. Getting cremated out in the open and on a huge funeral pyre with a lot of people gathered around your burning body might sound like the most legendary way to go out, as if you're a Greek hero who died a glorious death. But it's not exactly allowed in most modern communities, even if it may be part of many religious traditions. The biggest reason why this religious tradition has been banned in many places is public health and safety. Burning bodies in open pyres can release a lot of harmful pollutants into the air. It's like having a giant bonfire, but with some pretty unpleasant stuff mixed in. These emissions can harm the environment and people's health, especially in densely populated areas where air quality is already a concern. One minute you're saying goodbye to a loved one, the next day the homeowners association would be right up your butt for polluting the air. Open pyre cremations can also be very unhygienic if not done under controlled conditions. In areas where sanitation is a challenge, allowing open air cremations could only worsen waste management problems. Of course, many places worldwide have rules and regulations about how bodies should be disposed of. You can't just start a huge fire in your backyard to say goodbye to grandpa because open pyre cremations might not fit into those strict rules. So while some religions may prefer open pyre cremations, going out on a blaze of glory isn't really popular these days. That's why you might want to stick to crematoriums instead of looking to literally go up in smoke when you die. Hindu cow slaughter in India. You might want to leave your steak and burger cravings at home if you're going to India on a vacation, because you'll find that the Hindus in India tend to be quite protective of their cows. If cows had a social media account, they'd probably have more followers than a Bollywood star. These animals hold a special place in Hindu culture and religion. For many Hindus, cows are seen as sacred animals, symbolizing life and prosperity. The reverence for cows is tied to ancient religious texts and practices, where they're often associated with various deities and seen as a symbol of non-violence and gentleness. This spiritual significance is why many Hindus avoid eating beef or using cow products in their daily lives. They're practically royalty in India. Now, because of this deep-rooted reverence, many states in India have enacted laws banning cow slaughter. The laws vary from state to state, with some states having very strict prohibitions and others allowing limited exceptions. For some communities, especially those who are not Hindu, the ban can be seen as a restriction on their dietary choices and cultural practices. After all, being unable to eat a burger when craving one can be a mood breaker. There's also the economic angle, because cattle are important for farming and dairy production, so banning their slaughter can affect farmers and the agricultural industry. It's a classic case of trying to herd everyone into agreement, while some people just hope for a little beef on their plates. This is why the Indian government is in an utter dilemma regarding the situation of their cows. We don't beef with people who don't subscribe to our channel, but we do hope you subscribe to our channel and join our Discord so we can continue milking this success. Child marriage. Your childhood years are supposed to be all about playing out in the rain, getting your knees scraped, making friends, and, according to some religions, meeting Mr. Right. That's because child marriage used to be quite common among different religious groups. Some religions, like Islam and Hinduism, practice this tradition for different reasons, but they mostly involve the young girl's purity, claiming that women are at their purest when they're still very young. Marrying a girl before she reached her teen years was their way of ensuring that these women didn't do any extracurricular activities during their teenage years before marriage. However, child marriage has been banned in many countries for several reasons. The most important one is the protection of children's rights and well-being. Children, especially those under 18, often aren't ready to handle marital responsibilities. Imagine being expected to juggle schoolwork, remembering where you left your lunchbox, and the complexities of married life simultaneously. That's like trying to solve algebra while planning a grocery list. There's There's also the issue of consent. Children lack the maturity and legal capacity to fully understand and agree to the terms of a marriage. It's like asking someone to sign a contract when they still need help opening a juice box. Essentially, it's not a fair playing field, and that's why the law steps in to protect them from being forced into such life-altering commitments. So while it may be a tradition for some religions to marry girls off as soon as possible, modern societies have banned this practice. Nowadays, it's more important for young women to play with dolls and talk about their favorite Korean idols before marrying men old enough to be their fathers. Religious headhunting. Imagine a world where the ultimate status symbol doesn't involve having the biggest mansions, expensive cars, or hottest Victoria's Secret model wife. Instead, it's all about having the most heads collected, as there were tribes that participated in religious headhunting. And we are not talking about any regular heads, but actual human heads. This ritualistic practice involved superstitious beliefs, where possessing an enemy's head would allow you to capture their spirit and grant you power and status. Many indigenous tribes, such as the Ivoro of the Amazon, the Maori of New Zealand, and the Igorot of the Philippines, followed it. While hundreds of miles separated those tribes, they all believed heads were trophies celebrated in various ceremonies. If you were part of such tribes, your ultimate goal in life was to prove your strength and manliness by taking the head of a member of a rival tribe, so you could absorb the energy of the person and become a more respected member of the community. It was basically less about violence for violence sake and more about cultural beliefs and traditions. So instead of going through circumcision or your first beer as a rite of passage, you have to prove yourself a true and respected member of the tribe by collecting someone's head. Trial by combat. Let's say you were charged with the murder of your neighbor and you're brought into custody. However, instead of going through the entire courtroom drama, you can confront your accuser and demand a trial by combat to settle your dispute. It may sound like an episode of Game of Thrones, still it was widely practiced in Europe during the Middle Ages, when kingdoms and Christianity were so intertwined that even legal disputes were religious matters. Back then, this practice was often used to resolve accusations or legal problems, especially when the evidence wasn't strong enough to convict you, or if the parties simply couldn't agree. Imagine two lawyers having trouble with a settlement, and they just simply agree to allow their clients to duke it out. But instead of a boxing ring and gloves, trial by combat involved an arena and real weapons that could hurt and kill. The idea was that God would favor the righteous party, granting them victory and proving their innocence. So even if you know you're innocent, you're going to be guilty if you're facing a man as large as Shaquille O'Neal, because God already favored him the moment he was born. And that's where the problem lies. The practice is now officially banned in almost every part of the world, as not even God wants anything to do with two men who just want to get violent because they can't agree on anything.